Dr. Gaven Kerr from the Faculty of Philosophy at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. And he's going to be looking at God and the problem of suffering. So Gaven, you're very, very welcome to deliver your paper. Thank you so much.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks very much, everybody. It's good to see you all here. Okay, so God and the problem of suffering. So I'm going to talk to you for the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, just on the whole issue of God and suffering, and how the problem of suffering and its relationship to God has been brought out and illuminated within the context of COVID-19 and all the upheaval of the past year or so concerning that. So yeah, I'll speak to this for about 15 to 20 minutes on that, and offer some reflection on the end as to how we can resolve this whole situation with regard to God and his relationship to suffering. So, as we're well aware, needless to say, COVID has affected the whole world, literally the whole world. There hasn't been a part of the world that hasn't been affected by COVID. It has disrupted the lives of so many people. We all know somebody who, has had COVID, has been affected by COVID, and so on and so forth. Nobody has been untouched by it. Now, the interesting thing is, a lot of the sort of examples of suffering and disasters and stuff that we can point to, especially in the 20th century, were those of war or some technological disaster. There were some sort of man-made sorts of suffering, and there's the big ones that we can point to, like, say, in the 20th century. But what COVID sort of illustrates to us is that nature itself can have this great control over human life. And it can bring about these disasters. And we can point to, earthquakes, tsunamis, and so on and so forth. But, an earthquake or a tsunami or whatever, devastating as they are, it's confined to one geographical region. Whereas what we're seeing here is something within nature, just striking at the very heart of human life, just all over the world. And it highlights to us that we cannot escape nature. Sometimes because of our technical mastery, our rationality, just our abilities, we like to think that, we have this lordship over nature. It was a very, popular notion in modern thinking and modern philosophical thought that we're above nature and we're not part of nature. This was especially the case with Descartes and post-Cartesian philosophy. But what COVID brings to the fore, and what the Christian tradition was well aware of prior to modern thinking, is that we really are a part of nature, and nature does have a mastery over us. And what that brings to the fore is the rule of God, because God is the only agent that has complete and absolute control over nature. We may be able to manipulate nature in some sort of way to our advantage, but God is the master over nature. And now, for some, that may illustrate a complete and utter dependence on God, that once, we see ourselves as being mastered by nature and we have to act in accord with nature, we realize in a sense that, we have to work hand in hand with God. There has to be a cooperation there with God. But for others, and, likely for the majority of people in the secular world, what this illustrates is the so-called problem of evil. And the traditional problem of evil is that if God exists, then evil doesn't exist. But evil does exist, so therefore God must not exist. And continually in a lot of discussions on social media and on the mainstream media, you're seeing that happening. That, well, look, see if God is about and God, is good and God is loving. What's he doing in this situation? Why is he allowing this? Why is he permitting it to occur? So assuming that suffering is an evil, the suffering brought about by COVID does cause people to question God's existence. And it does cause people to wonder just what God is up to in all of this. Now, before going on and sort of discussing this in light of, the problem of suffering, I want to just bring up a preliminary issue on the problem of evil so as to set it aside. We can discuss it in the questions if you like, but it's just to bring this up just to set it aside so we can move on to the problem of suffering. It's usually assumed that anything that exists is caused to exist by God. And whilst that's trivially true, it needs to sort of we need to go a wee bit deeper into that. Any thing or any substance that exists is caused to exist by God. So God causes things or God causes substances to exist. And there's certain conditions in which those things find themselves. And those conditions have not been caused by God. God has not granted existence to those conditions. And so God is not responsible for the conditions that those things find themselves in. For example, if you're a sock maker, you make a sock, but you don't make the hole in the sock. The hole in the sock can come about as a result of the sock that you have made. But assuming that you have made the sock well, you're not responsible for the hole coming about. That could be brought about by some other situation. Similarly, and more generally, there can be certain privations in existing things that are not directly caused by God. God doesn't grant existence to these privations in the same way that the sock maker doesn't grant, doesn't make it so that there is a hole in the sock, unless that was his intention, but we're assuming he's a competent sock maker. Rather, God grants existence to the thing itself, and the thing itself can go on and develop various privations, which we call evil, yet God doesn't grant existence to them. Even though God isn't the creator of evil, God certainly is the creator of the universe in which evil occurs. Given that he is a good and loving creator, some explanation needs to be offered for the presence of evil or suffering, in this case, in the world. Now, the answer that I'm going to develop and talk about in the next while is that the presence of evil in the world is redeemable against some good that can be enjoyed as a result of it. And there's going to be a bit of a twist there, because this isn't going to be just your traditional, evil for a greater good account. Rather, it's going to be evil redeemable against the good in and of itself. But just on that notion that, evil is redeemable or suffering is redeemable against some good, there are a lot of common sort of innocent, non-controversial cases where we take that to be true. So, for instance, dental pain, maintaining a strict diet and exercise regime, all of these things, these can be taken as instances of suffering redeemable against some sort of greater good, such as healthy teeth, healthy body, longevity in life, which are valued in and of themselves. So usually when, you have dental pain, or, you're hitting the gym really hard, or you're on a strict diet, or you're fasting, you kind of say to yourself to get through it that, oh, well, look, this is worth it. It's worth it for whatever we're doing it for. So the good to be obtained through the suffering, it has to outweigh the suffering which is endured. Now, here is the question now when it comes to God. Can we say the same about all the evil, all the suffering within creation? Is there a good against which all the evil and all the suffering in creation is redeemable? And I'm going to say, well, yes, there is. And to do so, to lead into that, I'm going to focus on the Abraham and Isaac story in the book of Genesis. Scripture details a lot of suffering of people who were devoted by God. We just saw in Jesse's paper there, the exiled Israelites and their suffering and their prayer in the Psalms. And if we reflect on some of these stories, we can see how the suffering of these people devoted to God is redeemed. I'm going to kind of, reflect on one story, the Abraham and Isaac story. There are other stories we could reflect on. Indeed, there are non-scriptural stories that we could reflect on to kind of highlight this. So take the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is considered to be the father of the faith. This is St. Paul, Romans. He's the father of the faith, and he's a friend of God. Now, in Genesis, we see the story of Abraham is concerned with his desire for biological offspring. God promises a progeny to Abraham through his wife Sarah, despite her old age. But frustratingly for Abraham, and you can feel the frustration when you read the story, God doesn't make good on his promise immediately. God asks him to get up and leave for a foreign land on the promise of progeny, but God doesn't make good on this promise. In fact, he makes the promise to Abraham on 4 separate occasions: Genesis 12, Genesis 15, 17, and 18. And the first promise is made when Abraham is about 75 years old. On each occasion, as time moves on, Abraham becomes more and more frustrated with God's promise, frustrated that it hasn't been fulfilled. So he's getting frustrated with God. God is testing his patience here. After the second promise in Genesis 15, Abraham and Sarah take matters into their own hands, okay? And they get Abraham's maidservant, Hagar, and Abraham has a son with Hagar, which is Ishmael. Because in God's original promise to Abraham, it wasn't indicated that it was going to be through Sarah that his progeny would occur. So Abraham is 86 when Ishmael is born. So there was a break of 11 years from God's original promise to the birth of Ishmael. And in Abraham's mind, okay, promise has been fulfilled. We're good here. But despite that seeming fulfillment of the promise, Abraham and eventually Sarah, they find out in Genesis 17 and 18 that the son by which Abraham is going to be a father to a great nation is not Ishmael, but it's going to be from his wife Sarah. So still now, God's promise hasn't been fulfilled to Abraham. This son eventually comes along, and it's Isaac, and he's not born until Abraham is 100 years old, 25 years after the initial promise. So it takes God 25 years to fulfill this promise that he has made to Abraham, and Abraham is getting more and more frustrated and impatient as time goes on, even taking matters into his own hands. But the story doesn't end there. We have, okay, so Isaac has been born. We have Ishmael, Abraham's son from Hagar. Ishmael's about 14 years old when Isaac is born. So it means that Abraham has had this son, Ishmael, for those 14 years. And by all accounts, you know, Abraham loved Ishmael, didn't have a problem with Ishmael. And then, so Abraham has had this son, and then Isaac comes along and the promise is fulfilled. Abraham, you know, needless to say, is caught up here in a tricky family situation. This is a difficult situation for him, and you see this emerge at a weaning party held for Isaac. During this weaning party, Sarah, she perceives that Ishmael is mocking Isaac in some sort of way. There's something going on here, and Sarah isn't happy about it. And she demands from Abraham that Abraham dismiss both Ishmael and Hagar. Now, notice something there that, you know, Sarah thinks that Ishmael is mocking Isaac, nothing about Hagar, yet Sarah demands that Hagar leave as well. Hagar hasn't done anything here. Abraham, understandingly, he's distressed by this. But God recommends to Abraham that he follows Sarah's demand. Okay, so God lets it be known to Abraham that he should do what Sarah says. Not because Sarah is right here. Okay, so not because it's right of Sarah to demand that Ishmael and Hagar be dismissed. But as scripture tells us, it's because God intends to bless Ishmael, which is why God, you know, tells Abraham, you know, just, you know, follow what Sarah asks of you here. This is an ideal outcome for Abraham. Ishmael and Hagar are gone, even though Abraham is, you know, understandably distressed at this, and Sarah and Isaac remain. A tricky family situation has been untied here. And so following God's will in this instance, Abraham's following of God's will here, it wasn't exactly contrary to Abraham's interests. It was within his interest to follow God's will. It straightened out some tangled paths. It suited Abraham to follow God's will and dismiss Ishmael and Hagar. Given Abraham's previous restlessness, one could say doubt about God's promise, we need to ask, would Abraham have followed God's will if it didn't suit him? It suited him here to follow God's will. But what if Abraham was asked to do something by God that he didn't want to do? Given his restlessness with God's promise, we need to ask that question, and we soon find out, because as we know, God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. In this case, it doesn't suit Abraham to follow God's will. Okay, it's not within Abraham's interest to follow God's will. This is the son that Abraham waited for 25 years on the basis of God's promise. So now that he is being asked to sacrifice this son, it doesn't suit Abraham. Whereas before, when, you know, it was God's will just to follow what Sarah had demanded, that he dismiss Ishmael and Hagar, it did suit Abraham. So it wasn't exactly difficult to follow his will then. So what does Abraham do now? Well, Abraham is being asked to decide whether he believes that God will remain faithful to his promise. Okay, so this is the question, you know, does Abraham believe that God is going to remain faithful to that promise? God promised him a son, and that through this son, Abraham will become a great nation. If God is faithful to his promise, okay, so if God intends to keep his promise, then Abraham will retain his son, even though God has asked Abraham to sacrifice that son. If God remains faithful, if God keeps his promise, Abraham will not lose Isaac despite being asked to sacrifice him. And Abraham's response is well known. He gets up early in the morning, he travels to the place of sacrifice, he lifts his knife to sacrifice his son, and at the crucial moment, God brings things to a halt and a ram is sacrificed instead. So when asked to follow God's will on this occasion, when it does not suit him, Abraham does follow God's will. Now, from the beginning, Abraham was always somewhat hesitant in following God. He did follow God, but he was hesitant about it. He didn't fully trust God's promises. He undertook to fulfill God's promises by his own means. He took matters into his own hands through Ishmael. Abraham has to be brought to a stage of maturity and trust in the goodness of God, so that when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, Abraham knows that God will still be faithful to the promise of offspring. That even given that sacrifice, God will not permit him to lose Isaac. The years of suffering and doubt on Abraham's behalf were God's means for producing in Abraham the kind of love and trust in God that we usually only see amongst the closest of friends or spouses. Think about it. Think about spouses who have children. Spouses who have children, they don't usually trust other people with the safety of their children unless they're very sure that these other people will not harm their children. You look at how fathers roughhouse with their children, and you look sometimes at how mothers, are not too happy about this, about fathers roughhousing with their children. I speak from experience. But yet there's enough trust there to know that the father is not going to do anything to harm the child. And so that's the same sort of kind of relationship that is occurring here between Abraham and God. Abraham follows what God asks of him to do, because there's the sort of closeness, there is the sort of bond there between Abraham and God that you usually see between spouses, so that Abraham trusts God that no harm will come to Isaac. It took God over 25 years to produce this kind of character in Abraham, and as a result, Abraham not only had his son and thereby had his progeny, he becomes a friend of God. So these 25 years produced in Abraham a friendship with the creator of all things, so that as a result of that, Abraham comes to enjoy close personal communion with God. Now, what this highlights is that suffering undergone is redeemed through being brought into a loving relationship with God. St. Paul himself tells us that Abraham is accounted not only a follower of the faith, but a friend of God. And this gives us a clue to the good by which God redeems all the suffering in the world. Any suffering undergone can produce in the one suffering such a character that that person can enter into communal friendship with God, that person can become a friend with God. In other words, the good which God gives us, against which all suffering is redeemed, is not just any created good. Okay, so it's not just riches, honors, anything like that, good blessings. It's God himself. God himself is the good by which all the suffering of creation is redeemed. God is the good itself. There is no greater good than God. God is the measure by which anything is good, and God offers himself against which suffering can be redeemed. The Stoic ideal is not to be troubled by any suffering that you undergo. So the Stoic ideal is that you can't control your circumstances. All you can do is control your reaction to those circumstances, so that nothing can be troubling to you. But that's totally and utterly inhuman. Okay, one cannot but react to the suffering that COVID-19 has caused. Okay, it's very human to react to that suffering. We're not angels. Okay, we're not detached from our bodies. We're bodily creatures engaged in the world. So it is human to react with passion to this suffering. What I want to suggest is that whilst we can recognize this suffering for what it is and mourn over it, we should see our suffering as akin to the suffering of Abraham, and as an opportunity to grow in character like Abraham, to become friends with God. We're affected by suffering, but we're not constrained by it. So we should see ourselves in Abraham's situation during those 25 years, our character like his, slowly forming, and our trust in God never being lost. When Abraham's character was fully formed, he had such trust and friendship with God that he knew he wouldn't lose his son. Similarly, through suffering, our character is being slowly formed, and our trust in God is being made deeper. Being brought into friendship with God, having that love for God deepened through suffering, we know that God will be with us when we die, so that when we die in love with him. The full reward of God's eternal presence, the beatific vision, that's the supernatural happiness by which God himself is happy. We are made happy in the beatific vision by the happiness with which God is happy, not by any created or natural happiness, but it's God's very happiness itself, by which we are made happy in the beatific vision. That's the good we come to enjoy through friendship with God, and we can be made friends with God through suffering undergone. So God redeems suffering by offering us himself. So when we come to enjoy him, we realize that no suffering undergone in the world is comparable to the least joy experienced in heaven with him. So God isn't absent in any human suffering, but he's always present and inviting trust in him. This doesn't undo the suffering that one undergoes, because that suffering is real, just like dental pain is real. The suffering of fasting, diet, gym pain, all of that is all real, but it does redeem the suffering, since through it one is made a friend of God. Okay, so that's what I have for you. Ready to get stuck into the questions if anybody has any questions. I hope you enjoyed it.
I would say absolutely, amen. I fully agree that makes sense of some kinds of suffering. But there's a little niggle within me that there seems to be quite individualistic. This is about Abraham, and the suffering can be made sense of because it's Abraham's relationship with God. We also have Isaac, and so there's just a little bit of for me, it's something a little bit individualistic. Whereas when I'm looking at COVID and trying to make sense of the suffering, for me, yes, all suffering God can cause me to become more of a friend of God. But there's something in the suffering about COVID which seems to me that God is on the side of the sufferer, and that God is revealing to the world just how, the fault lines of injustice and, just how messed up the world is. There seems to be that the suffering of COVID really shines a light on that. And I'm wondering so I'm not saying no to what you've said, but I'm saying that's only one piece. And I'd say if I settled with that too quickly, it would make me quite insular. Me and God were cool.
So I think, what you say adds a further dimension to the picture there. So we begin with really obvious cases of suffering, which typically are individual and things that the individuals undergo. But then when we see those individuals as part of a community and constituted within that community, we see suffering that individuals undergo take on a life of its own, so that it's the community that suffers with the individual. And then that can sort of highlight and illuminate all the sort of fault lines that you point out, the injustices in the world. In other words, all the problems that occur in the world and all the various structures to which people are subject, which brings suffering not only to the individual, but to the community as well. And so that sort of understanding of suffering it can add a further dimension to the account of the relationship of God to the individual, but also to the community that suffers as well. So definitely, I think what you say there can be added to what I articulated, to what I said there. So from the chat, thanks. An objection could be made. Does this mean that no effort should be made to alleviate suffering? How does this mean of suffering help to a proactive approach? So no, I don't think, this means that no effort should be made to alleviate suffering. And that was kind of, one of the reasons why I brought up the Stoic notion at the end, because the Stoic ideal is that we shouldn't really sort of do anything to alleviate suffering. We should just get ourselves into a frame of mind as if the suffering wasn't occurring. On this account, we need to recognize suffering, do what we can to alleviate it, but alleviation of suffering doesn't mean that there simply won't be any suffering. So, you take the dental pain example, we try to minimize, dental pain, but it doesn't totally go away. And so we suffer through it for, whatever good against which it's redeemed, healthy teeth or whatever. So given that there is suffering, yes, we should alleviate it. But knowing that with alleviation, suffering won't disappear. And that's so that the only good against which all suffering is redeemable is God himself. So, Father Richard, I hope that at least initially addresses your question. How does this meaning of suffering help to a proactive approach? I suppose what it suggests is that insofar as in undergoing suffering, we can be made friends with God, that in dealing with that suffering and suffering through something, we don't lose heart, we don't lose faith, and so that we can sort of stay the course and realize this too will end. And as I say, that sits with the previous point, that we're not passive during suffering, that we do have to try and alleviate things. We don't just go out and search for suffering. So I hope at least, Father Richard, that's an initial response to your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And then what about human freedom and human choices, which have consequences for nature, may even cause pandemics and other plagues? Is it fair to blame God? Wonderful. That's part of the more extended question of the problem of evil. So, and that relates to the sort of preliminary point I made to set aside that privations that occur within creation are, in a sense, parasitic upon creatures. They don't have any being or existence independently of the creatures to which they occur. So like the hole in the sock, the hole doesn't have any reality independent of the sock. If it weren't for the sock, there would be no possibility of the hole. So when it comes to human choices, whenever humans make bad choices, what's going on there is that they're making a choice which is in some way inconsistent with the nature of the faculty by which we can choose, which is the faculty of the will. Now, the will is a desire for the good. The unfortunate thing is we don't always know what the good is, or sometimes we get it wrong what the good is. So, the classic example here is addiction. Somebody who has an addiction thinks that that's what they're addicted to is good. And because the will desires the good, then they desire what they're addicted to. But what the problem here is that that's inconsistent with the very faculty of the will itself, because once they sort of become addicted to something, they no longer have the sort of freedom or the willfulness to resist that addiction. They become slaves to the addiction. And so their addiction starts making choices for their will rather than they make choices for their will. All in all, what that is to say is that whenever human beings make bad choices, or what we call evil choices, or engage in intrinsically evil acts, we're doing something inconsistent with our nature, which is a privation of our nature. So like the hole in the sock, which is a deprivation of material in the sock, making evil choices is a deprivation of our nature, something that God is not responsible for. So we don't blame God for that. Yet there is obviously, and God does redeem that. God does engage in redemption of the poor choices that we make. It's called sin, and God has this sort of way to redeem sin. And I hope at least that initially addresses your question. That's kind of how I would take that if we went into a longer conversation with it.
Hello, Gaven.
Hello, Andre. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank
Great.
you for your answer. It's given me some clarity on the story of Abraham and Isaac,
Okay.
more than I had before.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
And I, most of me agrees with it, but a part of me is asking the question, what about the times when one is suffering and one is falling out with God because one is suffering? And even while one is suffering, one thinks, where is God? He's not listening to me. Is there a God? If one goes through all of those, processes, can one still, at the end of it, become a friend of God?
Yeah. I think, at least with regard to the Abraham and Isaac story, what you describe, resonates with what Abraham went through. Having had the initial promise, and then the further promises, and the 25 years that it took for God to fulfill that promise. Then even after that, everything undergoes that. No doubt Abraham goes through those sorts of doubts, those sorts of wonders, and indeed, Abraham, we see in the story, is frustrated. with God. He is impatient with God. He experiences the sort of things that you describe, because what you describe, in that relationship to God is doubt, is frustration, impatience, as they're going through suffering, all of which Abraham undergoes. And what the Abraham story highlights is that it produces a character in Abraham where, despite everything he's undergoing and all those frustrations built up over the years, it produced the character that was produced in him, one of patience and trust and so on, ultimately determines his actions when he's asked to do, what doesn't suit him, which is sacrifice his son Isaac. So there's a clear example of where it does sort of produce friendship with God, and a very deep, close and personal friendship with God. So if Abraham is follower of the faith and presumably a model for the faith, then it's capable of producing the same sort of character in us as well as what Abraham had. And I think similar things could be said, with the lives of the saints. We could look at, a number of heroes of the faith who, went through, similar sufferings, and they didn't have any special graces that we don't have. We have the exact same access to the same grace to which they had access in virtue of our baptism. So it wasn't a better sort of grace that, St. Teresa, Teresa of Lisieux, or any other of the great saints were given, by which they were able to undergo what they underwent. It was just the same grace that we have. So we can look to that as well to realize that the same character can be produced in us as was produced in them.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gaven, for a very stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. I mean, it's one of these age-old questions that we'll hardly exhaust today, and which people will be talking about for generations and centuries and millennia to come.